Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing, good sir?
It's been a bit of a tough day, but I'm all right.
Good to have you with us, and also we are joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
I'm all right, and you, Nick? You as well, Terence?
I'm pretty good. Before we get stuck into it, I just want to say that tomorrow we have the sort of Joburg launch of Anthea Jeffrey's book Countdown to Socialism, which is about the National Democratic Revolution, a key tenet of ANC, what explains the way the ANC operates in the country. You can check out, I think, the Free Market Foundation's website for some of the details on that. It'll be tomorrow night at about 6 or 6:30 if you want to go along and attend that. It is an open event to everyone. And also check out the IRR's YouTube channel, which is now split off from the Daily Friend channel. Okay, let us get into the news of today. And the first one is the ANC has apparently fielded a report to its highest decision-making body that suggests that the ANC really does have a shot of maintaining its majority in the next election. So the narrative, which has kind of become, I think, the kind of sort of conventional wisdom, although I think Marius has actually made a good point about pushing back against this, but we can get into that in a second, is that the ANC is pretty much fated to go below 50% in the next government election, following on from their 46% of the vote in the municipal election in 2021. The ANC document, however, says the ANC's decline is well known. What is hardly talked about is the ANC's decline and it's the DA's decline and vote shedding, and the EFF was growing dramatically but is now leveling. It is reaching a ceiling. And essentially, this ANC internal document suggests that the DA and the EFF are together not really in a position to grow much. It goes on to say about how new parties and community-based organizations are cannibalizing existing parties and are gaining seats in municipalities, provincial legislature, national parliament, and there's increased fragmentation of the party system. The advent of independent candidates in the 2024 elections may increase cannibalization and fragmentation of provincial and national government. Whether these political developments will improve the quality of democracy and development outcomes is still open for debate. It also says that parties like Action SA initially posed a threat to both the DA and the ANC, but this seems to be leveling off as well now. And the ANC essentially seems to be arguing in its internal document here that all the major parties have reached some sort of a ceiling, and the vote is just going to be too fragmented and too chaotic for anyone to be able to consolidate enough votes to push the ANC below 50%. That's the argument as far as I understand it. They do highlight the IFP as being their growth being a little bit worrying, seeing a revival from its decline that went from during the kind of heart of the Zuma years from 2009 to 2014. But even the ANC admits that seems to be turning around. The IFP is set to grow. So, Marius, firstly, the central idea here is I think that the EFF and the DA have ceilings and that they're basically at the maximum vote that they're ever going to get. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's a fair argument to make. In a democracy, every party has a ceiling. You know, a lot of people always arguing saying that the DA has given up trying to be a mass party, trying to get 50% or more, 50% plus one of the vote. And it's fine for the DA not to try to get 50%. It's got its niche. Same as the EFF. The EFF is never going to get more than, say, 15% of the votes in South Africa. And that's what happens in a proportional representation system. It's fine to go for, aim for 20, 25%. In lots of democracies around the world that use proportional representation, if you're getting 20 and 25%, you're the biggest single party in the legislature. Currently in the city of Joburg, the ANC is the single biggest party with 33% of the vote. So if you're aiming for 20, 25%, that's actually not a bad place to be in a multi-party system. And once the ANC goes under 50%, which maybe it'll be next year, I'm still not completely sold on that. Probably in South Africa, no party will ever get above 50% nationally ever again. I think South Africa's actually been an anomaly in a multi-party system where there's been a party that's regularly got more than 50% of the vote. Most countries around the world where there's a multiplicity of parties, it's very rare that a party gets more than 50% of the vote. The US is a bit different, but that's because there's only really two parties there. But in every other democracy, basically around the world, including UK, India, wherever, New Zealand, other European countries, Brazil, whatever no party. It's very rare that a party gets above 50% of the vote. But I think it's fair enough to talk about ceilings, and perhaps people like the DA and the EFF have got it. But I think it is an important point that these kind of community-based parties and smaller parties are definitely growing. If we look at the 2016 local government elections, 90% of people voted for the ANC, EFF, or the DA. In 2021, only 80% voted for one of those three parties. And actually, I've started putting together just a little project. I've been looking at things and just looking at fragmentation of votes in South Africa. So in 2000, in the city of Joburg, 9 parties were represented on the city council. In 2021, they doubled to 18. In eThekwini, hold on to your hats here. So in 2000, there were 10 parties on the eThekwini council, Durban. In 2021, there were 24. And this is pretty much the case for municipalities across South Africa, and I think we're just going to continue seeing this kind of fragmentation. And it's going to be a bumpy couple of years for South African democracy, I think. But I think good bumpy.
So I think I agree with Marius there that very much it's very likely that parties do have ceilings. I think part of the real question here, though, is whether those parties are at the ceilings. I think we've kind of argued, at least I have, that the EFF doesn't really seem set to grow at the moment. And the argument behind that analysis is that, in contrary to sort of the general perception out there, most South Africans actually are not really that keen on radical revolutionary politics, despite the high levels of unemployment, despite the inequality, despite the high levels of poverty, and that this is what limits the EFF's growth. The arguments about the DA have usually been something along the lines of it's seen as too much being representative of white interests or minority interests. I know that there's polling out there that says something like 20% of black voters consider voting for the DA, but they only get, I think the best they've ever done is about 7% of the black vote, something like that. 6-7%, somewhere around there. So that suggests that they're not at their ceiling, at least in theory, because they've got this chunk of voters who are every election on the fence about voting for them. They just don't manage to consolidate them. However, if you never manage to consolidate those voters, then it's effectively a ceiling, whether they're considering voting for you or not. Terence, what do you make of these arguments? Do you think that the ANC might be able to kind of hold on because no one else can get a large enough share of the votes, or are they going to die by 1,000 cuts where they actually will lose votes to these smaller parties? The DA and EFF have not stopped growing. What's your thoughts?
My sense of it is that at the moment they probably still have a decent shot at keeping an overall majority. Look, remember, there's still close to a year to go, so a lot of water can go under the bridge. That being said, I think that as sure as night follows day, the era of hegemonic politics is coming to a close. I do find what you said interesting about the DA's sort of latent support. And that was explained to me once in these terms, that disillusionment with the existing order has been a thing for 2 decades. But the two things that kind of hold it back. First of all, there have been some very real gains, particularly things like social grants. That's a small it's entirely rational to think that that's a matter of existential importance, and whatever thievery or whatever the ANC may get up to, that's your little designated benefit. The other thing, which I think is more sociological, and I've seen this again and again, and it's been said to me again and again, is that you can be one of those 20% in the months prior to an election. When the election rolls on, people start talking politics, and the environment changes around you. The ANC has a particular resonance with people. They used to do these. I know in the 2009 election, there were these big street parties, where they'd show up with cars and motorcycles and, buy out all the shish and yamas, and, everyone would, and that was that sort of integrated people. You didn't want to be excluded from the community mood. And so, you might be willing to put your misgivings aside because so many other people seem willing to give it another give it another shot. I think also there's been issues with the way the way coalitions have functioned in Gauteng, though Western Cape rather more successfully. So yeah, as I say, it's a bit of a mug's game to try and predict. But I wouldn't rule the ANC out just yet.
So my feeling on this is that I think that there's probably more fluidity at the moment, just because the mood of the country is so depressed.
That much is
and
true.
that this means that the campaign is going to be really vital. The ANC's campaigns have sometimes been really strong, really well organized, really powerful. And sometimes they've been kind of do everything last minute, not very up to date, kind of drag themselves over the finish line. And there's not like a clear trend. They kind of have done a bit of both, I think, even in recent years. So I think that probably more than usual, the campaigning season is going to be very key here. Will the DA have inevitably there will be some sort of racially charged incident that will happen to the DA during the election campaign. How they deal with that, how they are seen to deal with that by voters, I think will be important for that. The smaller parties who haven't yet got representation at national level, will they be able to break out from the pack and kind of make a noise? And will the ANC be able to continue, as you say, Terence, that sort of hegemonic force, feel like they're still that hegemonic force? I know the EFF is actually pretty good at doing that, despite the fact that they're not that big. Marius, your final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm not. I could see the ANC still getting above 50% next year, just barely though. And I think what to watch with an eye to 2029 is what's going to happen in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. There, the ANC is definitely going to be under 50%. But, that doesn't mean that opposition coalitions are going to be able to take over. There, we might see a dry run for kind of ANC, EFF coalition, especially in Gauteng. But that said, though, the ANC and EFF seem to, their love affair seems to be breaking down in Gauteng as well. They seem to be not as cozy as they were previously. And even Fikile Mbalula, who I believe was actually fairly in favor of an EFF-ANC coalition before, has come out now and said, it's terrible, we'd rather go with the DA. So even an ANC-EFF coalition is, it's not a done deal, I don't think. So, yeah, as you say, things are very fluid at the moment. And, yeah, like we've said before, it's the Chinese curse. May live in interesting times. And I think that's currently for all South Africans the case.
Look, if I could just make one more comment on the question of hegemonic control. The ANC, I think, may have the numbers, but let's say the moral suasion, I think that is long gone. I think that they can hang on in a sense through those social bonds, and also through the as I say, through those real deliverables. But the idea that the ANC represented some sort of higher plane of morality, and there's a lovely quote from an ANC document about 20 years ago: the most important moral voice in the country on almost any issue. I don't even think people in the NEC believe that anymore.
No, probably not. I do think that one of the underappreciated values of why the ANC has been so successful electorally over the past 30 years has been because it has such an enormous structure. It has a branch in every single ward in the country. That branch is mostly functional. It can field candidates everywhere. It can do events everywhere. It's just able to be everywhere. And particularly when you're talking to voters who are not that engaged with the media world, that is an incredibly important thing in advancing them. And I think that's also why the opposition has tended to struggle. They just don't have the same kind of organizational impact anywhere in the country. And that is
they've
a failure.
They've also got the trade unions and large parts of the civil service that are
right. Exactly, and that's I think what helped them to build those structures is that they've had these things. That being said, I don't think any of the opposition parties have managed in 3 decades to build anything even comparable, and that's sort of explains why they're not as successful. But anyway, let's move on to our next topic. There have been protests at UCT. Well, I mean, there's often protests at UCT, but this one is quite interesting. So Professor Patrick Lumumba was coming to speak to the EFF as part of their 10th anniversary celebrations. I think it's the EFF's 10th birthday on Thursday, I think. Anyway. I remember EFF speeches, they often, I think, pompously call themselves the July 27th movement or something like that. Anyway, so as part of this, they asked this professor to come and speak to them at UCT. And he gave a speech which I believe Terence watched and I read some extracts from. It was kind of the usual sort of Africa must unite, the AU must be more influential, we must throw out the foreign meddlers, the IMF and the World Bank, who seek to shackle Africa to the chains of the foreign imperialists, that kind of rhetoric. But the reason there were protests against his attendance is because some of the things he said about gay people in the past. So the professor is a outspoken supporter of Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill, which includes the death penalty for people who have homosexual sex. I think they call it aggravated homosexuality. Yes, which is fairly vaguely defined, and in practice is essentially the death penalty for people who engage in same-sex relationships. And he's also talked previously about how, I believe that this is un-African, that homosexuality is un-African, that gay people need to be quote-unquote cured. So the protesters were holding signs saying the EFF has blood on its hands and to hell with homophobia. This is also slightly awkward for the EFF, I think, because the EFF themselves have actually criticized the Ugandan bill. In fact, Julius Malema led a protest outside the Ugandan embassy in Pretoria. So the university responded to all of this, saying the university has noted with concern the comments that have been made by the speaker and the critical conversations that have emerged as a result, and urges the external host to engage these accordingly. Which is a very measured statement. Terence, what do you make of this?
Look, this is a particularly interesting one for me because there was something very similar a couple of years ago. The case of Fleming Rose, the Danish editor who was invited by UCT's Academic Freedom Committee and then was disinvited because his appearance would, as the head honcho at UCT at the time, Max Price, said, probably retard the process, the cause of academic freedom. My God, you want to hear, he might say things that upset people, or he may have done things in the past that upset people. Okay, I suppose first off, I wholeheartedly disagree with Professor Lumumba. By the way, the name PLO Lumumba, that actually is his name. I at one stage thought that this was some sort of internet meme, but there it is. I've watched some of the stuff he said about that. Look, I don't endorse it. I don't agree with it. I think that the legislation is dreadful and cynically intended. But I would also say that his views probably represent a very sizable majority of people in East Africa. And I'm not saying this thing that's right. what interested me was a lot of the commentary that was going around before this, in protesting his appearance at the university, which was that the EFF has blood on their hands, and the university should be a safe space. It seems to me that university, as long as your physical safety is guaranteed, which isn't always. Sometimes with the let's say guilt by omission of university or university authorities. But in terms of the exchange of ideas, and if you want to talk about being part of being engaged with the continent, these are views you have to that you have to engage with. Now, I think one of the big ironies is that I watched his address, and this is a man of considerable intellect. As I say, I'm somewhat familiar with some of his other work. And essentially, what he delivered was somewhere between a campaign speech and a church sermon. I actually have seen him address religious audiences elsewhere, very, very much in that sort of vein. He said nothing that I thought was of any real significance. It was mostly boilerplate that he probably didn't really have to prepare, but he delivered it fairly competently, and he didn't mention the LGBTQ issue at any point. But the point I want to make, and this goes back to the Fleming Rose affair. A controversial speaker came to a place where controversial ideas should be expressed. The sky did not fall. I don't think anyone was killed. And if I can just remind our readers, after our listeners, after Fleming Rose was disinvited, the Institute actually invited him to South Africa, and he delivered two talks on our behalf, one in Johannesburg and one in Cape Town. This is what Gwen and Gwenya said at the time. If I may be self-deprecating on Rose's behalf, I doubt Rose's speech will signal a watershed moment in the South African dialogue and free speech. He will speak in a room hosting a tiny fraction of the South African populace. The sun will rise in the east and set in the west. The next day, students will shuffle to lectures. People will queue in the morning at taxi ranks. Nobody, in W.H. Auden's words, will stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, or prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Free speech, I do not think is anything to be afraid of, and I think particularly on a university campus, I think it loses its entire soul if you're going to prioritize comfort, no matter how offensive and egregious you may find those views to be.
So, Marius, I'd like your thoughts on this one. What kind of strikes me though is, and I pretty much agree with what Terence said, is that I do get the feeling that this was not an EFF speaker, and we already have the example that Terence used. And sure, it was a few years ago, so maybe things have changed, but that the university perhaps would have had stronger views on the issue, whereas they had this very moderate response, saying that the host should engage with the criticisms made of the speaker, which they should. But I don't know. What's your thought?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's quite likely there've been somebody invited by another political party and some, shall we say, controversial views. Maybe the university wouldn't have been so, let's say, chilled about it. But I think it also shows the EFF slip here. I mean, they marched against these laws in Uganda, but now they've invited a speaker who's quite in support of these laws. So, I mean, I don't think that the EFF is really actually opposed to, or Julius Malema himself or Floyd Shivambu, whoever, actually thinks those laws in Uganda are that bad. I think they just know how to play the media. And, a lot of people in the South African media, they will, in the chat room classes, will lose their minds over something. Say Helen Ziller says something, and it's pretty milquetoast compared to some of the stuff Julius Malema says. But I think Julius Malema really knows how to play the kind of, I don't know how you'd put it, your kind of like sort of soft lefties in the media, and they're like, oh, this is great. He's standing up for gay rights, which is, of course, I also agree with that. You should definitely, those laws in Uganda are terrible. But then I wouldn't be inviting a person who said that these laws are actually amazing to be hosted on a platform that I'm in charge of. So I think it shows you their slip is, I mean,
It reveals the EFF's ideological priorities, right?
Yeah, exactly. So which is fine, but then there's also, it helps. I mean, you should be, I think, it helps to be kind of firm on what your principles are. And I think the EFF has shown that its principles aren't particularly firm, apart from one or two things. I mean, Julius Malema sometimes, a couple of years ago, he was a great big Rob Mugabe fan. Now he's not really Rob Mugabe's greatest fan or ZANU-PF's fan. So I think, they flip-flop a lot, even around Jacob Zuma. I think there's a good example. They were, Jacob Zuma was public enemy number one, according to the EFF, in 2015, 2016, 2017. Now suddenly he's this great man of African and black liberation that the EFF must support. So I think it shows you it's all, it's just playing what makes most sense at the time. And I don't think they're really, they're not really coming from first principles with a lot of the things they say and do.
Well, if I may look, let me unearth my inner Pan-Africanist. You Pan-Africanist, you Terence. When he was interviewed on TV, Professor Lumumba did make the following point. His issues seem, while I don't think he feels particularly kindly about homosexuality and transgenderism and all the rest. Part of his objection was, seems to come from this, ideologically Africanist point of view that you need African solutions to African problems, and we have our distinct culture and all that. And I do take a skeptical view of that. But he did say, why are people coming to Africa to lecture us about this? Would they go to the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or to Brunei and say these things? No, they won't. I mean, it was. I remember it was about 2 years ago, one of the big accounting firms had, during Pride Month, the rainbow icon, on its Twitter handle in every region apart from the Middle East. Just interesting that. Yes,
having a lot of oil money changes things, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I know, so in this instance, I will, I will say that the good professor possibly has a point. Look, as I say, I'm not justifying what Uganda is doing, but I do. I don't think that coming from where he does, that is an entirely fringe position, and I think it's far more productive to have to try and have some sort of dialogue. Here's the question though: would the people protesting be willing to put him on a platform, alongside someone from the UCT LGBTQ organization to actually have that debate, or would that itself be seen as platforming? These to my mind are real questions.
Something to think about. All right, let's very briefly go over our very last story here. And it looks like things have been going well for the Pretoria coalition, anti-ANC coalition. The coalition had a lot of fighting, and there was mayors who didn't get elected. It was a lot of drama, but things seem to have calmed down since the election of Silius Brink. And now the DA is seeking to, it looks like, extend more of an olive branch to Action SA by creating the position of deputy mayor in the council, which will be given to an Action SA MMC, member of the mayoral committee. It's already someone who's represented in that government, and this is something it seems like all the coalition members are pretty much behind. And it's not unprecedented. Pretoria doesn't have a deputy mayor position, but there are deputy mayors in some municipalities around the country. This is, of course, supported by Action SA, but the EFF and ANC have become very upset. They say that it's going to cost too much money. They've thrown around the figures of 4 million rand a year or 12 million rand a year. And the EFF statement read as follows, quote, "In the typical fashion of a low self-esteem lover who begs the allegiance of a partner through gifts and other expensive items, the DA has gone as far as to create a position of deputy mayor to keep the Action SA happy in this ineffective marriage of convenience." Marius, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's usual bluster from the ANC and EFF. I don't think it's a bad idea to have a deputy mayor position if it stabilizes coalition. It's also nothing new. A lot of municipalities around South Africa have deputy mayors. Cape Town has one, and there's some trivia for you. The deputy mayor is Eddie Andrews, who played rugby for the Springboks, and he's probably the highest position the Springboks ever reached politically in South Africa since Dawie de Villiers, who was also a Springbok, and he was a cabinet minister in the National Party and ANC cabinets. So there's some trivia for everybody. But yeah, I think, as I say, it's just normal ANC EFF bluster, and I don't think it's a bad idea if it can stabilize the coalition in Tshwane.
Terence, your thoughts briefly.
Well, I don't know. Maybe they can get the VBS Trust Fund to pay for it. So we should speak to the EFF about that. But here's a concluding point. And sorry, just coming back to my hobby horse about Professor Lumumba. Why would somebody who has been so outspokenly critical of post-colonial African gun governments want to go and stand up on a stage and sing the praises of a party that pretty much embodies all of that? That I think was one of the great unspoken ironies, and you heard it here on the Daily Friend Show.
Very good. All right, that's all the time we have for today. I've just been load shed, so that's wonderful. And I hope you all have a wonderful and productive week ahead. Cheers.